My name is Alara Vance. For most of my life, I believed that love was a quiet thing, a gentle current that carried you forward without much fuss. I was an archivist by trade, a woman who found comfort in the hushed order of the past, in the certainty of catalogued histories. I lived in a small, sun-drenched apartment in Savannah, where the air hung thick with the scent of jasmine and the weight of stories untold. The world I built for myself was one of soft edges and predictable rhythms. Then I met Julian Croft. He was different, all sharp lines and confident strides, the heir to a shipping fortune that had shaped the coastline for generations. He saw my quiet as a port in his storm, a place of calm he wanted to anchor himself to. I, in turn, saw his confidence as a strength that might coax me out of my own carefully curated shell. We fell in love, or so I thought, under the sprawling arms of live oaks draped in Spanish moss. The day his mother, Eleanor, slid a prenuptial agreement across the polished mahogany of their dining room table, she did so with a smile that was as brilliant and cold as a diamond. "Just a formality, dear," she'd said, her voice like chimes in a winter wind. "To ensure everyone leaves with what they brought." And he, my fiancé, my Julian, just sat there, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder, silent. They saw me as a placeholder, a pretty, pliable creature they could arrange in their life until a more suitable legacy bearer came along. They thought I was desperate for their world, that my quiet was a sign of weakness, of having nothing to bring to their gilded table. They had no idea. I came from a long line of women who spoke in whispers, whose histories were written in the margins. But silence, I would learn, is not the same as powerlessness. When I inherited a trust valued at $29 million, their faces, the carefully constructed masks of polite society, cracked, and the truth spilled out like cheap wine. You ever wonder what happens when the woman they tried to erase becomes the one holding the pen? Before we dive in, tell me, where are you listening from right now? And have you ever been told to know your place, just before you discovered that your place was far bigger than they could have ever imagined? It was a Wednesday afternoon when the envelope arrived, thick, cream-colored, the kind of stationery that felt heavy with unspoken rules. The return address was embossed in a severe, gold foil font, the Croft Estate, Osprey Island. No first names, no hint of warmth. Just the family name, a monument in itself. I left it on my small, cypresswood kitchen counter for a long while, sipping lukewarm tea and listening to the lazy hum of the ceiling fan as it stirred the humid Savannah air. I already knew what it was, a summons disguised as an invitation. When I finally broke the seal, the script inside was a relic from another century. You are cordially invited to an evening of formal celebration at the Croft Estate to honor the union of our son, Julian Croft, and Miss Alara Vance. It didn't say, our engagement, it said, our son's union. The possessive pronoun was a subtle, deliberate fence. Julian called an hour later, his voice a breezy counterpoint to the weight of the cardstock in my hand. "Did you get it, darling?" "I did," I said, tracing the sharp edges of the gold foil. "It's very dynastic." He laughed, a sound that didn't quite settle. "It's just tradition. One night. My parents want to make a good impression." I didn't say what I was thinking, that the Crofts didn't make impressions, they made declarations. The following evening, a late spring rain had washed the world clean, leaving a damp, earthy scent on the air as I drove across the causeway to Osprey Island. The Croft Estate wasn't a home, it was a statement. A long, crushed-shell driveway wound through acres of manicured lawns, culminating in a sprawling Georgian mansion that stared out at the sea with 100 unblinking windows. It was too pristine to feel welcoming, more like a museum of wealth controlled, curated, and cold. A valet in a crisp white jacket took my keys without a word. At the massive double doors, I was met by Eleanor Croft herself. She was dressed in a sheath of navy silk that rustled like dry leaves, her smile a masterpiece of polite restraint. "Alara," she said, her eyes sweeping over my simple linen dress with an appraisal so swift it was almost invisible. We're so delighted you could join us. I wanted to believe her. I truly did. Inside, everything gleamed. Marble floors so polished they reflected the cold light of the chandeliers, air chilled to a precise degree, and family portraits that lined the grand hallway like silent, judging ancestors. A painting of Julian as a boy hung above the fireplace, blonde hair, a serious expression, already looking like he'd been taught the weight of his own name. Dinner was held in a formal dining room with ceilings so high they seemed to swallow sound. I felt small, even in my best heels. Julian stood as I entered, a brief, nervous smile flashing across his face. He gestured to the chair beside him, but didn't move to pull it out for me. I sat, the damask napkin heavy in my lap, and tried to return the polite nod of his father, Richard Croft. Richard was a man carved from the same hard, elegant wood as the furniture, solid, expensive, and unyielding. The conversation flowed around me like a river I couldn't enter, shipping routes, port expansions, charitable galas, and polo matches in cities I'd only read about. I tried to contribute once, mentioning a local historical society project I was working on, preserving the Gullah Geechee oral histories of the coastal islands. Eleanor blinked slowly, a perfect arch to her brow. "How charming," she murmured, lifting her wine glass in a gesture of dismissal. Julian was uncharacteristically quiet, picking at his food, a man holding his breath in his own home. Every time our eyes met, he offered a fleeting, apologetic half-smile, as if that were a form of currency. Dessert was a lemon tart, its sweetness cut by a sharp, acidic bite that reminded me of my hostess. Then Eleanor stood, her posture regal. "I hope you all enjoyed the meal," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the quiet room. "But before we raise a toast to the future, we have a small family tradition to observe." A familiar prickle of unease ran down my spine. The room fell into an anticipatory hush. From a rosewood sideboard, she retrieved a slim, black leather portfolio and placed it on the table in front of me with a soft, definitive thud. "We just ask that our new family members acknowledge a small formality," she said, her lips curved into that beautiful, bloodless smile. I opened it slowly. A prenuptial agreement. 6 pages of dense, legal text printed on heavy, watermarked paper. All assets to remain separate. No claims in the event of divorce. No stake in the family trust. No inheritance. Nothing. Julian didn't move. He didn't reach for my hand. He didn't shake his head. He just sat there, his jaw tight, his silence a deafening roar in the sudden stillness of the room. As if on cue, he slid something small across the table toward me, an elegant, gold-plated fountain pen, engraved with our initials, J and E. He had given it to me when I arrived. "Just a little something," he'd said, his voice warm, to mark the beginning. I'd thought it was romantic. Now it sat beside a document designed to ensure my erasure, the very instrument of my capitulation. I looked at him again, a silent plea. Still nothing. Not a flicker of protest. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "It's just a precaution, dear. In case things don't work out, we want to make sure you leave with nothing you didn't come with." That last sentence landed not like a slap, but like a slow, deliberate cut. Nothing you didn't come with. As if I were arriving empty-handed, a beggar at their feast. I sat there for a long moment, the silence blooming around me, thick and suffocating. The room waited. One of Julian's cousins smirked into his brandy. Finally, I picked up the pen. I turned it over in my hand, feeling its cool, deceptive weight. Then I placed it gently back in its velvet-lined box and closed the lid with a soft click. "I'm not sure what I walked into tonight," I said, my voice even and clear, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. "But it doesn't feel like a family." I stood up, my chair scraping softly against the marble floor. There was no drama, no shouting, just a quiet certainty that had settled deep in my bones. As I stepped back, I caught Eleanor's expression. Not anger, but a calm, almost serene satisfaction. She looked directly into my eyes and smiled, a victor's smile. I didn't slam the door on my way out, though every fiber of my being screamed for a loud, definitive end. I simply walked out of that house, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against floors that would never welcome the dust from my world. By the time I reached my car, the drizzle had returned, painting soft, blurry streaks across the windshield. I sat for a moment, engine off, my hand still clutching the velvet box with the golden pen inside. It felt heavier than it should, not in ounces, but in the weight of everything it now represented. I drove slowly, the causeway stretching before me like a path out of a bad dream. The wipers swished back and forth, a hypnotic, metronomic beat, but the silence inside the car was louder. I could still hear Eleanor's voice, smooth as silk, sharp as glass, so you leave with nothing you didn't come with. As if I were a transient guest, they were politely, but firmly, showing the door. What gnawed at me wasn't just her cruelty, it was Julian's abdication. The man who once traced the lines on my palm and whispered that my quiet hands held more stories than any book had watched me be dismantled, piece by piece, and had looked away. The city lights of Savannah blurred as I turned onto my street. The Croft estate was miles behind me, but its coldness had followed me home, clinging to my clothes, seeping into the spaces between my thoughts. When I pulled into my driveway, I left the engine running, listening to its low hum. There was a strange peace in the rhythm of the rain, a moment of stillness before the world came crashing back in. It didn't. Inside, I kicked off my shoes and dropped my clutch on the kitchen counter. The apartment smelled of old paper and lavender, my sanctuary, my own small, quiet world. I poured myself a glass of water from the tap, the cool glass a comfort against my palm. I didn't drink. My phone buzzed. I knew it was him without looking. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times until it fell silent. 10 minutes passed. Then came the knock. Soft at first, then firmer. I crossed the living room, my bare feet silent on the worn hardwood floor, and opened the door. Julian stood on my doorstep, soaked through, his expensive suit clinging to him, his blonde hair plastered to his forehead. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, stripped of his usual confidence, like a ship without a rudder. "I didn't know she was going to do it like that," he said, his voice low and strained. I didn't step aside. I didn't invite him in. It was supposed to be a formality, a quiet conversation with the lawyers. I told her not to spring it on you at dinner. I leaned my shoulder against the doorframe, a barrier between his world and mine. "But you did nothing." He swallowed, rain dripping from his eyelashes onto his cheeks. I froze. I didn't want to cause a scene. My gaze was steady. "You didn't want to embarrass your mother." He blinked, the truth of it landing between us. She's always been very particular." I let out a slow breath. "That's not the problem, Julian. The problem is you let her be." "I'm not her," he insisted, a note of desperation in his voice. "Alara, you know me." "No," I said, the word calm and final. "Tonight, I realized I don't." His mouth opened, a rebuttal forming, but no words came. I didn't give him the chance to find them. I closed the door gently. The latch clicked into place, a sound of quiet finality. Only then did my legs begin to tremble. I walked back to the kitchen, switched on the warm overhead light, and stared at the pen on the counter. It glinted under the light, a monument to a promise that had been a lie. J&E. I slid down against the cabinets, my knees drawn to my chest, the glass of water still in my hand. My home, my safe place, felt violated. That kind of hurt, the betrayal of inaction, settles deep in your marrow. I would have preferred a screaming match. At least shouting is a form of engagement. Silence is an erasure. I didn't cry, not right away. I tried to intellectualize it, to file it away like a historical document. This is how families of generational wealth operate. This is about asset protection, not love. But it was personal because his silence was personal. His silence said, I see you floundering, and I will not reach for you. Sometime after midnight, I stood, poured the water down the sink, and picked up my phone. I scrolled past Julian's name, past the string of missed calls and unread texts. I tapped on Maya's name. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and immediate. "You didn't sign it, did you?" she asked, no preamble needed. "No," I whispered, and then my voice finally broke. "But I don't know what I'm engaged to anymore." She was quiet for a moment, but hers was a different kind of silence, a supportive, listening quiet. "You're not crazy for feeling this way, Alara," she said finally, her voice firm. This wasn't about love. It was about control. It was a loyalty test, and you were the only one who didn't know the rules. I sank onto my sofa and closed my eyes. Maya continued, "Listen to me. I've seen families like the Crofts. They think money gives them the right to write the narrative for everyone around them. But wealth doesn't buy decency." My eyes fell on the pen again. I thought he was different. "So maybe it's time you start asking what they think they're engaged to," she said, a sharp edge to her voice. "This isn't a fairy tale, Alara. You don't walk into a boardroom negotiation unarmed. Call me in the morning." She hung up. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside me was just beginning. I didn't sleep. Instead, I opened my laptop. The cursor blinked on the screen, a patient, rhythmic pulse. Midnight bled into 1 a.m., then 2. It wasn't just insomnia, it was a deep, unsettling need to understand. My mind had decided, without my consent, that rest was a luxury I couldn't afford until the truth was unearthed. Every file on my computer felt like a potential clue. Tucked away in a folder labeled "Wedding Plans" was an email from Eleanor sent months ago. Subject: "A few preliminary thoughts." I had skimmed it at the time, charmed by her seeming enthusiasm. Now I read every word. Buried in a paragraph about venue deposits was a link to the Croft Family Foundation's online portal for vendor verification. My fingers flew across the keyboard. It took a few tries to guess the password, Julian's childhood dog's name, a detail he'd shared on our second date. I was in. I navigated to the bylaws and governance section. And there it was, under a subclause titled Marital Asset Integration, dated 18 months prior. In the event of a marital union involving a primary heir, where a prenuptial agreement is declined or remains unsigned by the non-Croft party, said party shall be formally excluded from any and all entitlements related to Croft holdings, including but not limited to estate inclusion, executive board appointments, and any capital gains derived through family trusts. I sat back, the air leaving my lungs in a rush. This wasn't a defense mechanism triggered by my arrival. This was a pre-existing condition. A tripwire, laid long before I ever walked into their lives. I met Julian 10 months ago. I kept digging. Every document Eleanor had ever forwarded, every seemingly innocuous email. A pattern emerged, a language of polite exclusion. "We've already secured our preferred caterer. The floral arrangements have been handled by our family's long-standing vendor. No need for you to worry about the invitations. Our stationer has it all in hand." I was being included in the notifications, but never in the decisions. I was being managed. Around 5 a.m., my eyes burning, I made a cup of strong, black coffee and paced my small kitchen. I watched as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the tops of the oak trees outside my window. A sanitation truck rumbled down the street. The world was waking up to a new day, and so was I. A memory surfaced, sharp and sudden. Richard Croft, at a charity luncheon months ago, clinking his glass against mine. "We're not the sort to make enemies of our complications, Alara," he'd said with a paternal smile. "We simply ensure they remain outside the estate walls." At the time, I'd thought it was a clumsy attempt at a compliment. Now I understood. I was the complication. A text message lit up my phone screen. 6:14 a.m. It was Maya. "Alara. I did some digging on the public record. That bylaw? It was filed by their family attorney 2 years ago. The metadata shows it was drafted right after Julian's last relationship ended. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. This wasn't even about me. It was a template. A preemptive strike against any woman who might one day stand in my shoes. I was a variable in an equation they had solved long ago. And Julian, he had walked me right into it. The hours that followed were a blur of quiet, focused activity. No tears. No rage. I took out a fresh legal pad and a pen, my own pen, a simple, reliable ballpoint, and began to write. A list of every contribution I'd made, every project I'd consulted on for their foundation pro bono, every grant proposal I'd helped refine when their expensive consultants failed. I had the drafts. I had the email chains. Another text from Maya. "Are you okay?" I typed back, getting there. And then, as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across my living room floor, my phone rang. The caller ID read, Richard Croft. I let it ring 3 times, took a deep breath, and answered. "Alara," he said, his voice the epitome of calm, reasoned authority. I wanted to clear the air. This business with the prenup, it's not personal. It's tradition. Our family has been wounded in the past. This is simply our protocol. "Is that what I am to you, Richard?" I asked, my voice flat and devoid of the emotion he expected. Protocol. There was a pause, a brief crack in his composure. "I'm saying you're a smart girl. You understand how these things work." I did. I understood perfectly. This wasn't a family, it was a corporation, and I had been a prospective merger they were trying to acquire with zero liability. When the call ended, I placed the phone face down on the table. My little apartment, with its second-hand furniture and stacks of books, suddenly felt like a fortress. They thought I would be intimidated by their wealth, that I would sign away my dignity for a seat at their table. They thought I came with nothing. They had forgotten to ask about my history. That morning, I drove to the county courthouse, not for a marriage license, but for a public records search. The air was still cool, the streets of Savannah quiet. I found a parking spot under the shade of a magnolia tree and took a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind was a place of crystalline clarity. Maya was waiting on the steps, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee and an accordion file that looked ominously full. "I pulled the probate records for your grandmother," she said, handing me a cup. "And the trust filings for the Croft family. You're going to want to sit down for this." Inside the courthouse, the air was still and smelled of floor wax and old paper. We found a wooden bench in a quiet corridor. Maya opened her laptop. "This bylaw," she said, tapping the screen. It was filed by a proxy, a junior associate at their law firm. But the authorization email came directly from Eleanor Croft's personal account. I sipped my coffee, the warmth doing little to thaw the chill inside me. So, it was her. It was always her. It was their strategy, Maya corrected gently. And Julian was the delivery mechanism. The cold reality of it settled over me. I wasn't an unfortunate casualty of a protective mother. I was a target. Selected, vetted, and managed. And he knew. The question I'd whispered into the dark the night before echoed in my mind. Did he ever love me? Maya's silence was answer enough. We didn't stay long. There was nothing left to uncover. The story was written, I just hadn't read it yet. Outside, Maya had to run to a deposition. I told her I was going home to sleep for a week. But when I arrived back at my apartment building, a small, unassuming package was propped against my door. It was a simple brown cardboard box, wrapped in twine, with no return address. But I recognized the wax seal instantly, the stylized V of my father's family crest. My heart hammered against my ribs. My father, a man of few words and even fewer displays of affection, had passed away 6 months ago. We'd been estranged for years, a gulf of unspoken grief and misunderstanding between us. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I picked it up. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a single, handwritten note on his old letterhead. Alara, if you are reading this, it means the time was right. Beneath the note were several manila folders. I opened the first one. It contained official documents, a revised will, notarized letters of instruction, and a trust certification from a law firm in Wilmington, Delaware. The dates were recent, from the weeks just before he died. The letters outlined a transfer of assets, a diversified portfolio managed by a private wealth firm, and the deed to a tract of undeveloped land along the Georgia coast, land I'd thought was lost to back taxes decades ago. The final page was an appraisal summary. Total value, $29 million. I sank to the floor of my hallway. The documents fanned out around me. It wasn't the number that made my vision swim. It was the sudden, overwhelming realization that my father, a distant, difficult man I thought had forgotten me, had seen me. In his own silent, complicated way, he had left me not just wealth, but armor. He hadn't said, "I love you" or "I'm proud of you." He'd said, "You are not nothing. You never were." Tears finally came, not the hot tears of betrayal, but the quiet, cleansing tears of being found. And in that moment of profound, sorrowful clarity, it all clicked into place. I wasn't trying to marry into their family. They had been trying to acquire mine. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through my apartment window, I gathered the documents, placed them in my fireproof safe, and dialed Maya. She picked up immediately. "Talk to me." A small, genuine smile touched my lips. "I'm better than okay." I paused, taking a breath. "I need you to draft some papers for me," I said, my voice steady. "Because tomorrow, I'm going back to Osprey Island." Another pause. "And this time, I'm bringing my own pen." They welcomed me with champagne flutes and brittle smiles. I raised my glass and smiled right back, but this time, the reflection in the polished marble floor showed a woman who was a guest in no one's house but her own. I walked through the same grand foyer, and this time I noticed the faint hairline crack in one of the columns, the slight discoloration of the grout around the entryway tiles. The estate no longer felt imposing. It was just a house, big, expensive, but ultimately fragile. Julian was the first to approach, his tailored blazer doing little to hide the tension in his shoulders. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my coat on a moment longer. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice." Behind him, Eleanor stood like a ship's masthead, clad in cream-colored silk. "We're so glad you reconsidered, Alara," she said, her tone implying my return was an act of surrender. "I didn't reconsider," I said pleasantly, setting my leather satchel on the sideboard by the dining room entrance. "I came to continue the conversation." We moved to the formal parlor, the same room where I had once felt so small. Richard offered me a chair, and this time, I took it not as a guest, but as an equal. Lunch was a performance of culinary art: seared scallops, saffron risotto, figs wrapped in prosciutto, food designed to distract and impress. The conversation was a carefully curated tour of neutral topics: art, travel, the weather. No one mentioned the leather portfolio. No one mentioned the unsigned papers. They were playing a game of polite amnesia. I played along, nodding and smiling, a perfect model of composure. "You seem very centered today, Alara," Richard remarked, a hint of approval in his voice. "Poise is a quality we admire in this family." Eleanor added softly, her eyes holding mine, "You're learning how things work. It suits you." I placed my fork down gently and reached for my water glass. "Thank you," I said, letting the silence hang for a beat before I continued. "I suppose I am." The plates were cleared. Coffee was served in delicate porcelain cups. I saw Eleanor watching me, then Julian, a flicker of triumphant certainty in her eyes. She thought she had won. The butler moved to refill our cups, but I held up a hand. "Before we continue," I said, my voice quiet but clear, commanding the room's attention, "I'd like to add something to the table." All eyes turned to me. I reached into my leather satchel and pulled out a simple, navy blue portfolio, almost identical to the one they had given me. I slid it across the polished table, where it came to rest directly in front of Julian and Eleanor. "What's this?" Julian asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "It's my prenuptial agreement," I said calmly. A small family tradition from my side. The air in the room became still and heavy. Eleanor's hand froze midair, a sugar cube held between her silver tongs. "I beg your pardon?" I leaned forward, my tone conversational. "It's quite straightforward. Full transparency of all assets, joint control of all future marital income, and shared intellectual property rights for any ventures or foundations established during the marriage." And I tapped the corner of the portfolio, a reciprocity clause. It stipulates that any pre-existing familial bylaws regarding spousal inclusion, like the one in the Croft Family Foundation Charter, are rendered null and void upon signature. A sharp intake of breath from Eleanor was the only sound. Richard cleared his throat. "Is this some kind of a joke?" "Not at all," I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I just believe that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Since we all value tradition and legal clarity so much, I thought we could start our new family on a foundation of true equality." Julian stared at the portfolio as if it were a venomous snake. "You can't be serious." "I'm perfectly serious," I said. "I'll need it signed today, or the engagement is off." He pushed his chair back, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "You're bluffing." I reached into my satchel again, slowly, deliberately, and placed a pen on the table beside the portfolio. It was my father's pen, a vintage Montblanc with a faint patina of age, the pen he'd used to sign every significant document of his life. I didn't have to say a word. Its quiet, substantial presence on the table said everything. Richard's eyes darted between the pen, the portfolio, and my face. He was a businessman. He was calculating risk and leverage. "I think we should have Franklin take a look at this," he said, gesturing to the hallway. A moment later, their family lawyer appeared, a man named Franklin with slicked-back hair and an air of perpetual impatience. "What seems to be the trouble?" he asked, glancing at me dismissively. "She's brought her own prenup," Eleanor snapped, her voice losing its silken edge. "This is an ambush. It's absurd." "Actually," I said, turning my calm gaze to Franklin, "it's perfectly standard. Notarized, reviewed, and it contains a primacy clause that supersedes any unsigned prior agreements." Franklin looked to Richard for guidance, but it was Eleanor who spoke again. "You can't just march in here and demand we throw away decades of planning because you found a clever lawyer." "Oh, I can," I replied softly. And then I reached into my bag one last time. I pulled out a second, thicker envelope, cream-colored, with my father's wax seal still intact. I slid it across the table to Franklin. "This was included with my father's estate. You'll find a notarized declaration of my inheritance, establishing me as the sole beneficiary of the Vance Trust. You may be familiar with some of its holdings, including a majority stake in Blue Heron Logistics." I paused, letting that sink in. Blue Heron was a major competitor to the Crofts shipping lines. Franklin's eyes widened as he scanned the first page. "It also contains a letter of intent," I continued, stipulating that should I enter into a marital union with a competing family entity, a full merger of assets is conditional upon a signed agreement of mutual transparency. Otherwise, the trust's assets are to be leveraged to initiate a hostile takeover. That includes, by the way," I added, turning to Eleanor, "the primary funding for the Coastal Preservation Initiative you're chairing." My father was the anonymous donor. Eleanor went pale. Franklin unfolded a smaller, aged piece of paper that had been tucked inside. He cleared his throat, hesitated, and then read aloud, his voice flat. "If they ever try to diminish you, Alara, remind them what you're made of." It was my father's handwriting. Julian was frozen, his mouth slightly agape. When he finally found his voice, it was a reedy whisper. "This isn't fair." I turned to him, all the quiet hurt of the past few days coalescing into a single, sharp point of clarity. Neither was being invited into your home, under the guise of love, only to be handed a document designed to strip me of my worth, while the man who claimed to love me sat by and said nothing. He dropped his gaze to the table. Richard let out a long, weary sigh. "For God's sake, Julian. Sign the paper." Eleanor looked as if she'd been struck. "Richard, you cannot be serious." "I am deadly serious," he bit out, his eyes on me. "You wanted an alliance, Eleanor. Here it is. Just not on the terms you dictated." Julian stared at my father's pen. Then, with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, he picked it up, uncapped it, and signed his name. His signature was a jagged, angry scrawl. I said nothing. I simply took the portfolio, folded it carefully, and placed it back in my satchel. I stood up. "Thank you for your time." No one spoke. I walked to the door, my posture straight, my steps measured. Franklin opened it for me, a flicker of something that looked like respect in his eyes. The late afternoon air was cool and crisp against my cheeks. I wasn't running. I wasn't escaping. I was simply leaving. Back in my car, I closed the door, shutting out the world of the Croft estate. The silence was a balm. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and finally, I cried. Not the wrenching sobs of heartbreak, but quiet, steady tears of release. Not everything that is broken can be fixed, but sometimes, just being seen for what you are is a victory in itself. And I had been seen. Not for what they wanted me to be, but for the quiet, unyielding strength of who I was. My phone buzzed. A text from Maya. "Lucy from their PR firm just reached out. Says she has something you need to see. Immediately." I pulled the car door closed, the sound a soft, definitive thud in the quiet of the late afternoon. I sat back, the leather of the seat cool against my skin, and let the silence settle for a few long seconds. The grand gates of the Croft estate were a distant monument in my rearview mirror, already shrinking, already becoming part of the past. The phone buzzed again. A new message from Maya, this one with an attachment. "Lucy just sent this. It's the internal marketing proposal they presented to their board 6 months ago. The subject is Project Anchor. Alara, your Project Anchor." I opened the file. My thumb scrolled through slide after slide of charts, brand sentiment analysis, and projected media reach. And there, on slide 3, was a candid photo of me, taken on one of my first dates with Julian, laughing in a sunlit park. Beneath it, in bold, corporate font, target asset, Alara Vance. Narrative profile, authentic, intellectual, old Savannah, aesthetic. Ideal for brand humanization and media redemption arc post-port scandal. They hadn't just vetted me. They had branded me. I wasn't a fiancé. I was a strategic asset, a public relations tool, a soft-focused story to distract from a recent controversy over environmental violations at one of their ports. My head fell back against the headrest. The world outside my car window seemed to mute. I didn't feel anger, not a hot, fiery rage. I felt a profound, chilling clarity. I laughed, a single, sharp sound that held no humor. They thought I was a narrative, I whispered to the empty car. But I'm the author. I drove, not home, but to a small, quiet coffee shop downtown, the one Maya had said Lucy frequented. It smelled of roasted coffee beans and old books, a pocket of peace tucked between a noisy pub and a tourist shop. Lucy was at a small table in the back, her hands wrapped around a mug as if for warmth. She was young, with kind, worried eyes. "Ms. Vance," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Alara," I corrected gently, sitting across from her. "You risked a great deal to do this." "Thank you." She pushed her laptop toward me. It was open to an email chain between Richard, Eleanor, and their head of PR. Eleanor's words jumped out at me. Her background is perfect. The archivist angle plays beautifully for the legacy narrative. Julian's emotional attachment is a bonus, but not a requirement. Lucy's voice was soft. "When he found out about your inheritance, I heard him on the phone with his father. He said, now we don't have to hide it. Now we can be real partners." It was the first time I ever heard him sound happy. A sad, Hollow feelings settled in my chest. He wasn't happy because he could love me freely. He was happy because my newfound wealth made their strategic merger socially acceptable. It made the story even better. I nodded once, closed the laptop, and pushed it back to her. This wasn't just a leak, Lucy. It was a liberation. They're going to try to ruin you, she warned. A faint smile touched my lips. Let them try. That evening, back in my quiet apartment, I didn't pace or rage. I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat by my window, watching the lights of the city begin to twinkle. I logged onto the elegant wedding website Julian's assistant had created. At the top, a new banner had been posted. Event cancelled. The Croft and Vance families regret to announce the indefinite postponement of the wedding due to unforeseen private matters. Below it was a statement from Eleanor, a masterpiece of veiled insinuation about breaches of trust and confidentiality. I didn't flinch. I clicked the edit button, a privilege they had forgotten to revoke. I deleted her text. In its place, I typed a single, quiet sentence. The truth is not a private matter. Then, I uploaded a single file, the 27-page Project Anchor proposal. I hit publish. No explanation. No angry tirade. Just the document, speaking for itself. Then I shut my laptop. The silence in my apartment was deep and peaceful. I didn't check my phone. I didn't watch the news. The truth, I knew, had its own momentum. It took less than an hour for the story to break. Croft Heirs engagement, a PR strategy, read the first headline. By morning, #Project Anchor was trending. The story wasn't just about a wealthy family's deceit. It was about the cold, corporate commodification of a human being. It resonated. The fallout was swift and decisive. The environmental group that had been protesting the Crofts' port operations now had irrefutable proof of a bad faith cover-up. Major sponsors pulled their funding from Eleanor's charitable foundation. A national museum declined her annual donation. Richard Croft was called to testify before a Senate subcommittee on ethical business practices. Julian released a video statement. He stood in front of a fireplace, looking earnest and wounded. Our family has been the victim of a malicious, out-of-context attack, he said. My feelings for Alara were, and are, real. This is a private heartbreak, not a public spectacle. He never once mentioned the proposal. He never once took responsibility. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was an unknown number with a DC area code. Ms. Vance? My name is Anya Sharma. I'm the director of the Athena Initiative. We fund women who are dismantling inequitable systems. We've been following your story. We believe you. And we want to know what you plan to do next. I looked around my quiet apartment at the stacks of books and the soft lamplight. I thought of my father's pen, of my grandmother's forgotten history, of the silent strength passed down through my bloodline. I'm not just dismantling, I said, my voice clear and steady. I'm building. The inbox pinged just after dawn. I hadn't slept, not from anxiety, but from a quiet, thrumming energy. It was the feeling of a new foundation settling. The email was from Anya Sharma at the Athena Initiative. The subject line, our offer. 3 weeks later, I stood on the steps of a historic brownstone in Georgetown, a building that housed their main office. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and ambition. They offered me not just funding, but a platform. They wanted me to spearhead a new branch of their work. I gave them one condition. We'll call it the Vance Project, I said. And our mission won't be about telling stories of victimhood. It will be about providing the resources for women to reclaim their own narratives legally, financially, and publicly. They agreed without hesitation. Our first project was a digital archive we called The Fine Print, a collection of anonymized stories from women who had been trapped by inequitable contracts, both marital and corporate. It was a quiet, academic, and devastating exposé. I wrote the introduction myself, not as a spurned fiancé, but as an archivist. I framed it as an act of historical preservation, a record of the invisible ink used to write women out of their own lives. I never heard from the Crofts directly again. Richard stepped down as CEO. Eleanor retreated from public life entirely. The last I heard, Julian had moved to London, seeking anonymity. Their empire didn't crumble, but it was diminished, tarnished by the one thing their money couldn't control, the quiet, unassailable truth. One evening, months later, I was working late in my new office. The windows looked out over the soft, evening lights of the city. I poured myself a glass of wine and opened a bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was the black leather portfolio containing the Croft prenup, the one they had presented to me. I had asked their lawyer to send it. I took it out and placed it next to the navy blue one I had brought to their home, the one Julian had signed. 2 contracts, 2 different worlds. One designed to diminish, the other to equalize. I didn't feel triumph, just a quiet sense of distance, as if I were looking at artifacts from another life. My computer chimed. An email, forwarded from an old university account. It was from Julian. 5 words. Did you ever love me? I stared at the question. The Alara who had sat at that dining room table, heart pounding, would have agonized over the answer. But I was not her anymore. I knew that love, real love, doesn't ask you to sign your worth away. It doesn't stay silent in the face of injustice. It shows up. I didn't reply. I simply dragged the email to the trash. Then I opened a new document. It was a letter, not to him, but to the woman I used to be. You were not too quiet, I wrote. You were listening. You were not weak. You were waiting. They mistook your stillness for surrender, but it was the stillness of a deep river, gathering its strength. I shut my laptop and walked to the window, wine glass in hand. The city was a tapestry of light and shadow below. My life was finally my own, not a story written for me, but one I was authoring, word by quiet, deliberate word. Some people will try to hand you a contract that defines your limits. But your real value is signed in the silent ink of your own resilience, the moment you realize you don't need their permission to be whole.